This is the story of the only woman I loved until I got married. My mother, Verda May Skaggs Cavendish. She was born the daughter of John Wesley Skaggs, a farmer in the area of Hyco, where we lived most of our lives as a family, and his wife, my grandmother, Lula Amos Brown, who was the granddaughter of a Cherokee Indian, as we understand. This next picture is one of them taken during the 1930s with one of my uncles and an aunt. This is the earliest picture we have of our mother when she was about 6 years old with her older brother Everett, taken about 1918. My parents were married during the time just prior to the Great Depression. Really hadn't had much chance to get adjusted until it came along. A very rough time for them, and of course for many millions of other people. But it colored her entire life and her attitudes towards a lot of different things, including money and possessions and poverty in general. She really never had a whole lot of money and didn't expect to, because that's the way she was born. My parents, in fact, lived in a log cabin at one point. My father worked under President Roosevelt's New Deal as a worker on the Works Progress Administration, and that was one of the few ways he had to earn money back during that time period. This next picture was taken of my mother with my older brother Jimmy, who died before I was born, probably in the early 1940s, and typical house that they lived in at that point. Other than her children, my father was the center of my mother's life. She was faithful to him during all the hard times that they lived together. He had a problem with drinking that was troubling not only for her but for us as well. And she usually stood as a shield between him and us during the worst times of this. This is a picture of her taken probably in the late 1950s, one of the ways that I remember her best back during that time. Our old house was similar to this, but without the visiting president, and the bed that we slept in was one with iron bedsteads, as we said. We had 3 of them that were similar to this, but not as fancy in terms of the surrounding or the way that they were covered. My sister slept on one, my brother slept on one, including I, and my parents slept on the one in the living room. We had a little 4-room house. We carried the water from a spring by the road in a bucket like this. That was our only water supply during the day, usually. And we all shared the same dipper that we drank out of for many years without getting a lot of disease that I'm aware of. One of the main items of furniture in the kitchen was called a kitchen safe. I didn't learn until very recently that actually meant a pie safe. I thought it was something that you store, that you put things in for security, but it wasn't very secure, so I didn't think that was quite right. We also had a kitchen cabinets or other main storage furniture in the kitchen. We ate around a big round wooden table similar to this one. Oftentimes in the earlier years, especially, it was very crowded when we came to eat together, but we were all expected to be there. Our dishes were washed after dinner by my sisters in a bowl similar to this one, and there was always some dispute as who was to wash them when. That was something the boys never had to do because, according to my mother's thinking, that was woman's work. Most of my mother's life was spent in the kitchen around her stove. It was a wood stove with a wood firebox and a oven and the burners on top. Very slow in terms of cooking food. Took a lot of time to cook a pot of beans, for example, or biscuits in the oven. In the kitchen we had an old morning stove, as we called it. and we used it to thaw water in the wintertime, which main purpose it served then. My mother made many biscuits, one of our staple foods that we ate usually 3 times a day during the years. Sometimes she would even get up in her sleep at night, making biscuits, not knowing what she was doing. One of our staple foods also was pinto beans, also for many years, cooked with bacon fat. Another staple that we shared together oftentimes was fried potatoes. Didn't have a very varied diet during most of the year. Kind of depended on what was in season. Breakfast we often had bacon, eggs, not scrambled, and biscuits. Sometimes we would have gravy and biscuits, what we called poor man's gravy oftentimes, which was flour and water and grease and milk sometimes, and that was pretty much it. The rest of the year our diet revolved around our garden. The first thing that my daddy planted in the springtime was leaf lettuce in his lettuce bed, and onions, because those could both be planted in early spring. They were often eaten in a salad together, and the onions sometimes were used in eating pinto beans, one of the springtime delights. In the summertime, we also shared in corn on the cob, came in usually in mid to late summer. We always had potatoes that we planted usually in late spring, and we took part in digging them up later on. Invariably, some of them rotten. My mother always canned food in the fall because that was the only way that we had of eating vegetables and fruit during the wintertime, was canning it. She did it on top of a stove, of course, and we would listen until we heard the lids pop, meaning it was sealed, the jar was sealed, and something that she did every fall, and food that we ate during the winter was stored in what we called the root cellar, which was dug into the side of the hill, just as this one was. Inside there were shelves full of canned food. Sometimes it would be in there for a number of years. Other than the house, the center of our life was school and church. The little church that we attended was called Mount Zion, and about a half a mile walk across the hall from where we lived. That's where I was saved at age 13, and my brothers and sisters as well, at least my younger sisters, and my mother oftentimes went with us. Besides her children, my daddy was one who my mother's life revolved around. She was faithful to him throughout their life. Sometimes things could be very difficult for them. As I mentioned earlier, he would sometimes come home drunk, and she was the one who shielded us from him. But she always loved him. She never really complained to us about the state of her life or how things were for her. And she just kind of accepted life as being the way it was. They lived together for over 50 years. Celebrated their golden anniversary in 1978, and they were together until my father's death in 1983. He had a stroke in 1976 thereabouts, and for much of the time between there and his life, he wasn't really aware of a lot of what was going on, and my mother cared for him without complaining, as always, at that time. Her children were the other people in their lives that their life centered around. This is a picture of some of us with my Grandpa Skaggs around 1959. A little bit later, when some of my other family had left home with a couple of my sisters and I, my mother, at that point. My mother did everything for us that she could. She made a lot of her clothes. I'm not aware that for sure that she made flour sack clothes like these, but I'm pretty sure that she did, and I do remember seeing tire sacks very often. The holidays that we celebrated included Thanksgiving. Sometimes we would cook the turkey that they'd raised, sometimes not, but it was very typical of Thanksgiving in those days. Christmas time was also a big time of celebration for us. My mother always insisted on buying something for everybody, for all of her grandchildren, even if it was just some little trinket or another, and for each of us as her children. And we would get together on Christmas Eve and open Christmas presents. That was our tradition, and we went out and cut our own tree and set it up ourselves and decorated it ourselves. Easter was another big holiday for us, mostly as a time to hunt for Easter eggs, which my father insisted on doing. July 4th was another holiday that we always celebrated. Basically a time for watermelon and ice cream. My father always cut the watermelons, one of the things that he had assigned to do. So I mentioned my father died in 1983, and this is a picture of us at that point. Before my mother died 7 years later, she lived by herself for most of that time, had running water and a commode that actually flushed. We didn't have to go outside and use a toilet as we did when we were growing up. She was the one responsible for my being a Christian, the one who I remember as being the most important woman in my life. Of course, without her, I wouldn't be here. And